From years of anxiety to warrior and mentor, Bradley Robinson created the Anxiety Project to help you end your anxiety naturally. Let's mold the new you and let's end anxiety together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anxiety Project podcast. Welcome to episode 329. I'm Brad Robinson, and today I'm really excited to talk to you about my journey finding God, finding peace in the transcendent, and really how I got to this point where I do believe in God, coming from a place, I didn't grow up a Christian. I didn't grow up going to Catholic school. I didn't grow up reading the Bible or being subjected to it by my parents, none of that. But I remember at an early age, I would swear and I would look up and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, God, for swearing." And I'm looking back on that, I was like, okay, I didn't really have an idea of God. I didn't grow up reading the Bible, but I did feel connected to God when I was a kid. I really did. I felt because I feel like we all are so connected to our what's it called, the conscience. We're connected to the conscience, and then we grow out of the conscience as we age. And I feel because we tread over it, we ignore it, we activate circuits that, what would you say, they override the internal dialogue. There's the effort voice, the effort, like, screw it, I'm gonna do this or say this or think this. And then that other conscience voice becomes less and less known in the body. And I've come to really understand God through stories, through reading Carl Jung, Eric Neumann, listening to Jordan Peterson talk about Pinocchio and Lion King in relationship to Carl Jung. And this really opened up. And also Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, very interesting. But when I started to learn about archetypes, it really opened the door for me. And what an archetype is something that is consistent across time, patterns that work. And that's the thing. The hero archetype is the embodiment of somebody who prevails and propagates and continues the lineage. And that's interesting. Success, what it means to be successful. It means to make the right sacrifices in order for the future self to thrive. It's being able to confront the terrible unknown so that you can gather the information from that unknown and share it with the community to defeat the dragon lurking in the unknown so that the community can thrive. It's the same thing, right? You defeat the dragon, and when you defeat the dragon, you gain the knowledge of how to defeat a dragon, and you get to share that and train the other people on how to manage. And we see that today. I mean, my story is a great example. I defeated my big dragon of anxiety, suffering, depression, depersonalization. And then I started to share this. That's why I created the podcast. I felt like I had to contribute something, and the passion was all in and of itself. The fact that I conquered something, the fact that I overcame something, that I had these revelations was necessary for me to share. It was an innate urge. And so I started this podcast, and the rest is history. And so I feel like we all have dragons to contend with. And the suffering that I was going through in my 20s, that was the catalyst to the change. God sent upon this storm, right? And you can think of the Jonah and the whale story. It's a beautiful example. It's the perfect example. where Jonah is called to help the people of Nineveh because the city's corrupt. You can imagine like a tyrannical society where people are not making appropriate sacrifices, that people are 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 just living in chaos, and Jonah is called by the conscience. He's called by God to go and help the people. And what a terrible thing. And why would you want to do that? Why? That's a terrible thing. That's way beyond your tolerance level. That's way beyond your comfort. And he decides to run away. He hops on a boat and leaves. And then when he does, the waters rise, the storm occurs, and the members of the boat go, well, who brought about this storm? And Jonah's like, yeah, it was me, because God told me to do something, and I kind of ran away from the responsibility. And so now he gets thrown overboard. But that's a really interesting part of the story, is he admits it, right? That's the thing, is a lot of us don't admit it. Like, yeah, there was that moment where my conscience was telling me I shouldn't have done that, or this feeling, or this feels wrong, but then you decide to do it anyways. And then the storm, maybe it doesn't even it's very subtle, but you start to live in a storm, and the storm becomes the normal. And I'll give you a good example of that. When I started to watch pornography, there was this voice that said, this doesn't feel right. This is not good. And then I ignored it because I trusted the wonders and the wisdom of Google, because Google says it's natural, it's normal, it's healthy for a young male to watch porn. And then that gave me this all clear. But that was not good. The conscience was right. And 12 years of being addicted, to the point where when I tried to stop 12 years later, the storm was so big. It was monumental. It was very trying and tough to navigate that storm. But I eventually did. And that's also another thing that I share with you guys on the community, is that dragon that I fought coming out on the other side. It was no joke. So Jonah gets thrown overboard, and because he admits his mistakes, he gets thrown overboard and he sinks to the bottom of the ocean, which makes sense. That's me when I was trying to battle pornography. I felt like this thing is just so beyond me, and you end up in the belly of a whale, essentially, and that's the heart of the matter. You're in chaos, and what happens when you're in chaos, when you're in suffering, is you then contemplate, right? What's your next move? How did you get here? Because when somebody suffers, when the rug gets pulled out from under you and the ice that you're skating on breaks and you fall into the abyss of chaos, something happens in your life that awakens you to chaos. What happens is your past becomes relevant, your present becomes relevant, and your future becomes relevant all at once. And so now your mind is mapping a whole plethora, a whole domain of landscape, and what is going over that landscape with a fine-tooth comb, wondering how you've gotten to this point in your life. So for me, I had to look back on everything, my relationship, and studying my old relationship and how that didn't work out. And then I realized that I was a lot to blame for what happened in that toxic relationship, and that was no picnic. And so all of these insecurities came up, and I had to confront them, like, oh my God, I caused this. That's a horrible place to be. The person that doesn't do that is Captain Hook, right? That's the funny thing, is he is always running from that clock, from time. Time is intimidating. Time is what exposes your vulnerabilities, your insecurities, what you've neglected. And he always runs from that, but it's going to take a piece out of you until you turn to it and you confront it. But the thing about it is, when you turn to it, you're going to realize, man, the more I've ran from this thing, the more I feel like I can't defeat it, right? Because it just grows and grows into something much larger than you wish it to be. That's the same thing that happens to people with addiction. John Vervaeke talked about this, and he said it so perfectly, but I can't remember exactly word for word, but I'm going to paraphrase him. He said something like, when you're consuming alcohol, it puts a Band-Aid over your problems, and so that feels good. And then when you keep consuming, it puts more and more Band-Aids on your problems, and then your competency to actually solve problems decreases over time, where then the world itself becomes less and less functionable or inhabitable, because you've decreased your competency so much that the world itself grew more and more complicated. That's the best word. It grew more and more complicated. And now that you've decided, because the alcohol is taking its toll on you, right? It's like it's causing you health concerns and problems, and you're neglecting all this responsibility, and you're hurting people and this and that. And so now all of these other problems are present because of the alcohol, and all the other problems that you ran away from before you started to drink alcohol are present. There's just too many problems, the plethora, right? It's too vast, and so people just drown themselves because the alcohol reduces the anxiety and depression, but your tolerance to the alcohol keeps heightening itself, and then you got to consume more and more and more and more, and then you're like the dragon that eats its own tail. At the end of the day, you're just going to drink yourself into oblivion until you have to make a call where you have to confront all the terrible things that you've drank yourself away from. And that's not a fun day, let me tell you that. So this is what happened in my 20s. I was doing all of these things. I was running away from time, just like Captain Hook. And so all of these stories from Jung and Jordan Peterson, they were laying out the archetypes, and they resonated with me. The hero archetype, the satanic archetype, and then I learned from Dr. Peterson that we do view the world through a narrative lens. And this makes a lot of sense. We don't see the world through just facts. We don't see an object and infer the fact. When we see an object, we see the utility in it. We see the purpose. We see what we use it for, because when we turn ourselves to an object, we don't say, our mind doesn't lay it out in factual terms. We see its utility. And is it going to help us in our goal-directed behavior? So we do see the world through narrative. And when we go see a Harry Potter film, Star Wars film, Hobbit, you name it, what we're seeing are these archetypes. Usually the cowboy, the good guy is wearing a certain way outfit, and then the villain is wearing a certain outfit, the black hat and the scarring of the face. We can usually unconsciously pick them out very quickly. And so I started to dive into archetypes. That this fascinated me. And then the biblical narratives stood out, because stories like Adam and Eve, what that means is you take the bite of the apple given to you from the serpent, and the serpent in a lot of ways is represented as Satan through other depictions of the story. And it's very subtle. It's described in Genesis as very subtle. And you take the bite and it opens your eyes, it awakens you to your own vulnerability and insecurities. And that's the thing, is when you take a bite of that, of chaos, of the temptations, it's going to open you up. And I took a bite of the temptations throughout my whole life. And it opens you up. It makes you self-conscious. It makes you aware of time itself. It makes you aware that we're finite creatures. A very terrible thing to encounter. That my anxiety disorder was that thing. It was this thing that I needed to change. And then the Cain and Abel story, as I talked about on this channel many times, making the right sacrifices, and the sacrifices that are insufficient, what's the consequence of that person who's shaking their fist at God, who generates resentment and bitterness when they're not being favored and the other person is being favored? It's easy to shake your fist at them and say, you know what, I don't like that person. That person needs to go. And instead of learning, instead of studying that person, you decide to dispense with the ideal. And what happens? Cain's suffering is too much for him to bear. It's way too much. It's way too much. And this is the biggest thing. This blew me away. God said to Cain, well, you invited that temptation in. You did. You welcomed it in, and you danced with it, and you had your way with that temptation, and you entertained it for a very long time. And so no wonder you're bitter and resentful, and why you're not being favored by the world, by God. And that blew me away. We just don't want to admit that we're holding on to things that that continue to spiral us downwards. And reading the Gospels, there's a moment where Christ is on the boat, and all of his disciples are on the boat, and they're crossing the stormy seas, and Christ is in the bottom of the boat, sleeping. And I learned this from Jonathan Pajot. The disciples are lose faith, and they're crying out to Jesus, "Oh my God, there's a storm. What do we do?" They're freaking out. And Jesus comes up and says, "Oh, ye who has little faith." And he stops the storm and the waters. And so what's interesting here is it's a reflection of the Jonah and the whale story. Because Jonah he runs away, right? And then the storms arise. He's on this boat. The storms arise. And in this story, Christ is on the boat. He's sleeping, right? And then once it's a reflection of the resurrection. He's sleeping on the boat, and he comes up, and then the storms settle. And it's also, that's so profound. Think about it like that. Think of that for the rest of your life. It's insane. I'm still trying to unpack this. It's incredible. So what the funny thing is, the disciples, even they've followed Jesus for so long, and Jesus is sleeping right under them. They know that. They know that he's there, but they turn away from him for a moment, and then they get so overwhelmed. But Christ comes up and he's like, no, I'm here. I'm here. You forgot about me. You've lost faith for a moment. And I think that's true in our lives is the storms rise up and we get so caught up in trying to put out the fire. And we forget that our faith, that this is what what we're going through right now, the storm, we can find solitude, we can find peace within the storm. We can surrender in the storm. And this is something that I've recently learned and I'm practicing. And I've been practicing surrender for a while now in more of the Buddhist sense, where I would when I would have a panic attack, I would say I surrender. I don't want to try and control what's happening, because that's the thing with panic is you're trying to control everything that's happening to you, and you're trying to put out the fire, right? And so for me is I've learned to relax, calm down, surrender, release. I release this. I relax. And so that's helped me. And it's the same thing. I'm not saying surrendering to Jesus and surrender, just saying surrender are different. They're the same thing. But I've come to Christianity through this process of, I've been surrendering, but then coming to the biblical stories beautifully lay out, narrativize the pathway to surrender, beautifully narrativize the pathway to living a fulfilling life through sacrifice, through love. And I want to get back to that story of Jesus sleeping under the boat. It's a reflection of Jonah, because Jonah, he comes up from under the boat and he jumps out, right, down into the depths. It's like a descent. And then in the Gospels, the Jesus, what would you say, image in the story, he's rising up and then the storm settles. And that's the thing is that we can find our peace and solitude in Jesus and what he embodies in that archetype. And what's funny about the Jonah story is when he's at the bottom and he's contemplating his life down there and how he wound up in chaos, and in that when he decides to, I'm gonna pursue God's calling and I'm gonna help the people of Nineveh, the whale spits him out onto the land, and that's the rebirth. And there's some beautiful imagery of Jonah emerging from the whale with a halo, right? He's coming up out of the water as the Jesus archetype, as the enlightened man, as it's the rebirth of Jonah. And so that's the thing is, when we come out of chaos, we're not the same people that we were before the chaos, before the storm. And this is why I love these stories so much, is because the more I look into them, the more I realize that these stories are us, and that we have to give up. We have to give up the things that we're holding on to if we are not feeling like our lives are what they should be. We're not enlightened, or we don't have the faith that we should have. And Christ says that to the rich man, right? The rich man approaches Christ and he's like, I'm doing all these things. I sacrificed so much in my life to wind up to where I am, but I'm just not there yet. I'm just not there. I'm still suffering. And Jesus says to him, well, you have to give up everything and follow me. and follow me. And that just, oh my God, like I understand. Like it's just, all this emotion wells up inside of me when I listen to that story. And then I see Jesus as this wanderer. And what's so, because he's a wanderer, right? He's serving the Lord. He's serving the Lord. And he's not riding around on an expensive steed and wearing beautiful garments and proclaiming the gospels from the rooftop. He's in the slums, in the bars with the sinners, because he says that the sick need a physician, not the already healthy ones that are around, right? It's the sick, the ones who are suffering. Because the Pharisees are like, why are you hanging around the sinners and the drunkards and the prostitutes? Because they're sinners. That's the very reason. And there's a beautiful image in the Bible where Jesus rides in to the city on an ass, and he told his disciples to go find an ass no one has sat upon and bring it to me. And that's the humility of Jesus, the humility, right? It's not about the accolades or the or how you are being portrayed, but it's the message. It's are people willing to look beyond the surface to something deeper? And that's why Jesus is walking around preaching the way he does. Is he's tapping into something much deeper, into unconscious processes. So I feel like I am more in tune with my conscience. I feel when I'm alone that I can have a really profound dialogue with myself, with God. I do feel like when I pay more attention to my day and I look towards the meaning of the suffering, then I transcend it. And this is another really important thing to know is when I was going through cognitive behavioral therapy and neuro-linguistic programming, I learned about reframing, looking at a traumatic moment of your life from a different point of view, a different lens, and extracting a meaning from that, the lessons. That's a really big thing to do in psychotherapy, extracting the lessons, the bigger picture of why you went through what you did, what you now know, why you're a new person, why you're that Jonah rising out from the waters. We're reading the Gospels, reading the Bible. It's full of the meaning that the suffering can bring you. And if you what would you say, if you maintain a certain faith and you approach suffering as something that it can provide you with some sort of meaning, and you can approach a panic attack as if it were an opportunity to make you stronger rather than it, something that's going to devour you. You're going to morph yourself into somebody different, and the suffering's not going to have that much of an effect over you. And so it's very difficult to explain, but I'm doing my best. I view God as the spirit of goodness that is wanting me to be better than I am. And when I go through something difficult, I turn to God and I ask, does this mean in for me? There's something to this suffering. I see this suffering as more as a gateway to something else, rather than suffering as being, well, I'm gonna shake my fist at the sky and really fall into a pit of loathing. It's something that opens you up. The suffering opens you up to something else. And that's where I'm at in my faith, is I view the suffering in these moments of my day that are very difficult as something that is meaningful, that it's meant for me to go through for some reason. And then when I explore that in my mind, I generate answers. I really do generate answers to that. It's making me stronger for such a reason. Maybe it's going to make me stronger in this area that I'm not really strong in currently. Maybe it's going to make me better in this area and a better speaker, a better communicator, right? Or better this, or better at this task, or, the world is so bloody complicated. It's so complicated. There's just way too much stuff that we just don't understand, and so little of what we already know. And all the stuff that we already know can be unpacked into all these micro things that could be changed and replaced. It's just so complicated, because the way you prep dinner and chop things and, cook things could be changed. You could change how you do it, or look closely into each micro movement and change the micro movements so that you could end up being more efficient at those things that you already thought you were efficient in. The world's too complicated. But when we look into it, when we look at the world through a meaning that we're supposed to go through what we're going through, then I believe it'll just unfold. I believe that the suffering won't have that great of a hold over you, that you can surrender and you can prevail and you can extract the meaning quicker and move on quicker. And I think that's a good place to conclude this podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening and being a subscriber and a supporter of the show. I really appreciate you. And remember to rise above anxiety. I'll see you next time.
Brad's powerful anxiety recovery program is now available at unpluganxiety.com. The Anxiety Project program is downloadable and puts the power of anxiety recovery in your own hands. Visit unpluganxiety.com for more details. Recovery starts now.